Hello, everyone. Today we are going to be looking at different types of errors in sampling. So far in Chapter 6, we've identified bad types of samples. That was 6.1, identifying bad types of samples. And then in 6.4, I believe it was, we talked about bias and variability and how samples can change. Um, and now in 6.6, we are going to be talking about different types of errors in sampling. So not necessarily bias, but just, errors, things happen. We all make mistakes. So just types of errors like that. So one type of error that we've already talked about a little bit is a random sampling error. So a random sampling error is the deviation between the sample statistic and the population parameter. The margin of error helps minimize this type of error. Um, and so an example of that would be like the bad methods that we had talked about in 6.1, like a convenient sample, only sampling the people that are right around you, or a voluntary sample where, again, that can create a little bit of bias because um, if you have a voluntary sample, you're likely only going to hear from the most passionate people. Okay, so those are examples of random sampling errors. But then there are a few different types of non-sampling errors. So a non-sampling errors are not related to the act of selecting a sample from the population. Okay, so a sampling error, sampling error, again, would be something where I guess you kind of have more control over it because you selected the population, or excuse me, you selected the sample. So it's an error with how you selected it. But then there are non-sampling errors, which we're going to go over here throughout. So the sampling frame is the list of individuals in the sample. Ideally, this should be a list of every individual in the population, but this is rarely available. Again, it's very hard to get a consensus being a statistic for the entire population, although theoretically that should be the goal, is to try to hear it from every member of the population. So one type of non-sampling error is suffering from undercoverage. So undercoverage is when some groups of the population are left out of the process by choosing the sample. We had an example of this way back in Chapter 3. And I don't necessarily remember or expect you to remember this, but it was on the homework. There's an example that talked about people were going around to different houses in the city of Minneapolis and asking if families baked their own bread. And I think they went to like 500 different houses, which is that's a decent sample. But the problem was that they went there during working hours. So that sample was suffering from undercoverage because anybody who has a 9 to 5 job was not going to be represented in that sample. And so that would be an example of a sampling error. And that type of error, again, is called undercoverage. Here's another example. Taking a poll by calling people from a phone book will exclude people without a telephone. Now, this example is obviously a little old, but the idea is that you're only calling people of phone numbers that you can find of who are listed. So anybody who is not listed, or again, nowadays almost everyone uses a cell phone, but in this case, using this particular example, you're leaving out people who are not listed in the phone book. So here's some non-sampling errors. Processing errors are mistakes in mechanical tasks such as doing arithmetic or entering responses into a computer. Response errors when someone gives incorrect information. Obviously something that would be out of your control, but if somebody lies to you, maybe you're taking a sample around the high school of kids who have smoked, and maybe they're going to lie to you because they're embarrassed or they don't want to get in trouble or whatever it might be. So that would be a response error. And again, that's kind of out of our control, and we theoretically wouldn't even know that that's happening, but that's one type of error. Non-response is the failure to obtain data from an individual selected for a sample. So you're trying to call someone, they never call you back. You send out a survey on Google or whatever, and they just never fill it out. A non-response is a type of non-sampling error. Again, might not be your fault, but it's something that we would need to consider when we're making a sample. And then the wording of questions. If it can be difficult to understand or biased towards one viewpoint, again, back in chapter 3, that was kind of one thing that we practiced, was writing questions of interest that were not biased. And so that can be another example of a non-sampling error. So it says determine whether it is a sampling error or non-sampling error, then determine the type. So it says contacting households to answer a survey regarding immigrants. Okay, and so, in this case, you are probably looking at a sampling error, because it says you are contacting households to answer a survey regarding immigrants. So first of all, it's voluntary, which could be a problem there, and so that again is going to be a sampling error. It says an inaccurate answer to the question, how many times have you been to the doctor in the last 6 months? So an inaccurate answer is a non-sampling error. Again, it could be because they were lying, or it could just be because they forgot. Okay, that's a non-sampling error. And remember, there were different types of non-sampling errors. And so in this case, that's a response error, is when you are lying or just forgetting. Okay, so non-sampling error and a response error. Okay. Determine if the wording of the question may cause a sampling error, so why? It says, do you favor banning private ownership of handguns in order to reduce the rate of violent crime? Okay, so this first one is an example of a sampling error, and the reason why is that last part there. Okay, whether that may or may not be true is beside the point. Okay, so you might have a study that has shown that if you ban private ownership of handguns, it is going to reduce violent crime. Okay, again, you might have a study that says that, but asking that question in that way, some people are going to look at that and say, well, of course I want to reduce violent crime, right? I mean, at the end of the day, who's a fan of violent crime? So by wording the question like that, you are inherently creating bias, because then somebody that says, well, no, I don't want to ban private ownership, you could come back and say, oh, you like violent crime. So again, that's just not a fair question. To make it a fair question, I mean, you could literally just take out the part that I circled and just leave it at, do you favor banning private ownership of handguns? Even that, I would say, has a little bit of bias, just because, do you favor banning private ownership of handguns? You would probably want to try to leave it more open-ended instead of saying yes or no. And so even that might have a little bit of bias, but for sure the last part needs to be taken out. Part B, how much stock do you own? So in this case, the person that's being surveyed shouldn't probably know what the goal of your survey. And so question B is a pretty just generic question. Like if somebody came up to me and asked me that, I would have no idea why they're asking me that. So I would probably just give them, an honest answer. There is no bias in that question. And then part C, are you for or against the death penalty? So, man, another typo, wow. Anyway, are you for or against the death penalty? So this is a good example. If I compare A and C, this is kind of a good example of what I was trying to get at. So in question C here, I would say that this doesn't really have any sort of sampling error, because it provides both viewpoints. Are you for or against the death penalty? Are you in favor or not in favor of banning private ownership of handguns? Because by only asking one side of it, you're kind of laying out your cards of getting the person to just answer the question that you're looking for, or give you the answer that you're looking for. So again, notice in part B, it's really general. Like, again, you don't even know what they're trying to get at. Same thing in part C. If I'm asking you that question, by me stating it like this, you don't know if I am for or against it because I gave you both options. But even in part A, if you were to take out this part and just say, do you favor banning private ownership of handguns? The person being surveyed would probably assume that that is my viewpoint, that I am in favor of banning private ownership of handguns. And that is also going to create bias because they might just not want to get into a debate or an argument with you. So they might just say, oh, that's your viewpoint. Yep, that's mine too. Right. So, um, you know, B and C are really good examples of questions because they're very general, or in this case, it provides both sides of the argument so you're not kind of laying out your cards. Okay. And so on your 6-6 homework, you're going to just be given different types of scenarios and figure out if there are any biases, any obvious biases in that scenario, and then what type of errors that would be: sampling error, non-sampling error, and then what type of non-sampling error. Okay. Have a good day.